The Rundown, Part 16, a Farlost story by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by one, by two, by three. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
Nick Usher stood on the edge of the crowd, staring at the backs of the councilors, the Haven SG delegation, and the black system guard uniforms, as the crowd around him clapped and cheered. Roland Bird's escape, the death and destruction on the pier, Pesh's death, all of it played perfectly into Councillor Underwood's narrative. Bennett Underwood couldn't have planned a better stunt to shift public sentiment for his trade negotiations. The back of Nick's neck itched, and he wondered, could Underwood have had a hand in the attack? It was an Underwood Company ship that was hijacked to spring Roland Bird. Nick shook off the thought and rubbed two fingers over his tie, feeling for the shape hanging from the necklace beneath his shirt, the file. He had collected enough evidence to know Underwood was at least as corrupt as some of the other counselors. He was just more adept at hiding it. But mass murder? Nothing in the investigation he'd been quietly running in his own time way off the books pointed to that. He'd even backed off digging into Underwood in the last few weeks. However corrupt he might be, there was no doubting Underwood's skill shaping public opinion. In mere minutes, Councillor Underwood had changed the mind of the would-be mob gathering in front of Piertown Hospital, and Nick was willing to bet he'd changed minds throughout the city just as completely. The system guard puppet master, Consul Gomersall, caught Nick's eye as he wandered back to the hospital's doors. The consul nodded down at him, a satisfied grin on his face. Nick just stared back. That one was dangerous, and he liked to play games. Our two people share a world, a history, and a common enemy, Farlost itself. Those were the words that the consul had whispered to Nick moments before the delegation had walked out to address the crowd. Just moments ago, Nick heard those exact words uttered by Haven SG's ranking leader, General Lehman Tarquis. The guard's total control of Haven couldn't have been more obvious if the photogenic, gray-haired general had bent his ramrod-straight spine for the consul to pat him on the head. Nick and everyone in Locklaw always knew Haven SG's governments were puppets, but somehow having the system guard's representative confirm it so casually made Nick's skin crawl and shot his cop mind into high alert. It was the consul's way of toying with people, Nick suspected. Automatic, like breathing. Whatever the reason, Gomersall's message couldn't be any more clear. The guard was coming to Locklaw, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Ascending the steps, Consul whispered something to a bewildered Donald Tyzan, the surprise poster boy for the conference. Then he again met Nick's eyes and tipped an imaginary cap before strolling inside. Tyzan, looking a little confused and more than a little angry, shrugged into the black civilian coat Gomersall had given him earlier with express instructions to hide his uniform, and made his way down toward the street. The reporter's shouts pelted the system guard cop, who clearly wasn't used to being questioned by a free media. The reporters smelled blood, and their cries ratcheted up a notch. "Officer Tyzan, tell us about your brother! Officer, look this way, please! Do you have any family left, sir? Do you think killing a terrorist will make you any less of one, sir?" That last one came from Jarvie, the Manta reporter Pesh's wife had a crush on. Ballsy Nick thought that the reporter was throwing hardball questions when everyone else seemed to be throwing softballs in line with Underwood's impassioned speech. The questions continued, and Tyzan stared dumbly back. Nick sneered, enjoying the sight of an enemy soldier struggling on this alien battlefield, until a twinge of guilt soured his pleasure. He tried to shake it off, but the words Bennett Underwood had shared, combined with Tyzan's shock at having his history and his loss trotted out for the reporters, had left an impression on Usher. He was angry at himself. Of course, Counselor Underwood's impassioned words had an effect on him. They'd had a politically motivated and very calculated effect on all of Locklaw. This was a system guard machine, not a person. But as Nick watched Tyzan blink, his mind vapor-locked by the glaring lights of the cameras after having his pain put so recently on display, he lost his brother. Tyzan knew what that felt like. Memories of Ben flooded him, burying his hate. Nick's feet took him towards the crowd. The encrypted slate in his pocket got him past the beat cops keeping the press from the politicians and the public from the press. He tapped an emergency code into the slate to kill the reporters' lights and cameras and held the device high, a hologram of his police badge rotating in the air above the screen. "All right, that's enough. No comment," he said. He pulled a thin black ball cap from inside his jacket. It came in handy during stakeouts. His suit jacket was reversible too, for the same reason. "Come on, Nick," wheedled Jarvie, whipping his two tails around eagerly. "We've got every right to ask here." Jarvie was one of the good ones. He'd kept his word to Nick and Locklaw PD before, keeping sensitive news off the nets. He'd helped keep Nick's face off the nets too. Raw as he was in the moment, Nick just stared at the reporter. Jarvie's tails both curled defensively, and he floated backwards, surprised by something he saw in Nick's face. Nick didn't care what the reporter saw. Ignoring the angry jeers of the reporters, he swung Tyzan around, slapped the hat on his head, and dragged the bewildered officer up the stairs on a diagonal towards the side of the hospital. Other people must have seen something in Nick's face, too. People stayed out of his way as he dragged the bigger SG cop down the ramps into the Ringway station. Their eyes followed, though, and Nick wasn't surprised. He expected a guard uniform to draw stares. A lot of those stares were directed at him, though. He didn't care about that either. Halfway down, he steered Tyzan and the tiles toward the outer ramp, toward the outer clockwise running Ringway line. A quick tap and the ID on Nick's slate triggered a secure elevator at the bottom of the ramp to open even before the flowing tiles under their feet had deposited them in the station. A few steps later, the doors closed behind Nick and Tyzan. "Sorry about your brother," Nick offered softly. There was a moment of surprised silence from the hulking soldier. "Thank you, Inspector," Tyzan said, his voice even more quiet than usual. Nick heard the sincerity and gratitude for Nick's consolation, and that made him angry all over again. Nick swallowed half-formed bitter words. He didn't want to like anything about Liaison Officer Tyzan. Neither man said another word. The elevator opened onto a secure ringway, reserved for cops, emergency services, first responders, and fat cat politicians. A private train car was already floating on the track ahead, summoned automatically by the presence of Nick's badge in the descending elevator. Tyzan again followed silently as Nick walked out of the elevator and to the right, ignoring the train car and walking down the drab gray basement toward the hospital. A blue and yellow stripe glowed on the wall ahead before the section of wall slid open to reveal a uniformed officer manning the emergency and supply post designed to defend the hospital. The tears and the Civil War were decades in the past, but even in places like Locklaw, you had to be prepared for the wolves, always. The policeman inside saluted. "Inspector." "Open a box," Nick called. "Yes, sir." The officer's tone had cooled a few degrees. He waved his hand in the air before a control panel and then stepped into the corridor to Tyzan's far side, hand floating near his holster. Another section of wall ahead glowed with blue and yellow stripes and rolled silently open onto a holding cell. Nick heard Tyzan sigh, saw his shoulders slump. "Inspector, do you want to dig with me?" "Fine," Usher said, his tone light, disconnected from the conflicted emotions he was ignoring. "After I take care of a—" His voice died in his throat. "A private matter." Tyzan's eyes narrowed. Nick knew he didn't believe, but that was just one more thing he didn't care about. "He's a guest, not a suspect. But," he told the guard, his voice becoming a growl, "do not let him leave until I call." Tyzan grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" The liaison officer's calm voice was uneven, emotion bubbling up like thermals rippling over hot tarmac. The uniformed cop grabbed Tyzan's other arm, applying just enough pressure to indicate what could happen next. Tyzan didn't even acknowledge his existence. Nick looked pointedly down at Tyzan's hand, then locked gazes again. Tyzan lifted his hand off of Nick, splaying his fingers wide in a peaceful gesture. "What would you do," he asked, "if it was your brother?" The simple question almost knocked the air out of his lungs. Nick's nostrils flared, his jaw clenched, but he locked that emotion down and turned to leave without another word. You have been listening to The Rundown, a Farlost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.